Hi, everyone. My name's Claire, and thanks for tuning into today's seminar. Today, I'll be talking about some of my PhD research on fracture coatings, and I'll be discussing how we could use them as a tool for mineral exploration. This research was done at Queen's University under the supervision of Dr. Daniel Latham-Matthews and Dr. Matthew Labaum. I hope you found it informative, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the talk. So society is facing a challenge in that the next Kavoo ore deposits are undercover and at depths previously not explored or in areas with transported cover that can mask any signature of an ore deposit at depth. This is a challenge as we really need new ways of exploring for these deposits. And this simple block model on the screen shows a buried ore deposit within an environment that is typically found within Canada. One way in that we can explore for mineral systems is with the use of geochemistry. And we use geochemistry as ore deposits are distinct, geochemical anomalies that create a deviation in element concentration or isotopic signatures that are different from the geochemical baseline in an area. In addition to the main mineralizing zone, ore deposits are associated with primary dispersion halos, which occur with the original mineralizing system, and tend to be limited in extent and close to the ore deposit, except in highly fractured zones, which allows for dispersion to migrate a lot further. And you also get secondary dispersion halos, which are associated with the remobilization of elements from the ore or primary alteration zone after ore deposit formation. And this tends to result in the secondary dispersion halo, which is larger than the primary. And we care about this as the bigger the geochemical footprint of a system, the more chance we have of detecting that geochemical signature, which is indicating, potentially mineralization nearby. There's a lot of mechanisms that play a role in moving these elements around our systems and creating these dispersion halos. And these are a few that have been documented within the phreatic and VDOS zones around our systems. It is quite complicated as you do have a lot of these different mechanisms acting in an environment, but the main takeaway I want you to take from this figure is that many mechanisms exist, but fractures are facilitating a lot of these mechanisms. And as I will be talking about an ore system in Australia towards the end of the talk, I just wanted to briefly highlight that these mechanisms can be similar or different depending on the environmental and geological setting that you're in. So this is just a block model representing, more of the Australian outback where I did some of my field work for this project. So fractures are important and will be the subject of my talk today, as they're providing these permeable pathways for these element dispersion mechanisms to remobilize ions from the ore or primary alteration zone into the surrounding rocks and overburden. Due to this preferential leakage of compounds and complexes along fractures and faults from the ore system, fluids can leave behind a distinct mineralogical and geochemical coating on the fracture surface, And if these fluids are associated with an ore deposit formation or have encountered an ore deposit nearby, they will likely contain a higher concentration of ore-associated elements that is different from the geochemical baseline, leaving behind a fracture coating that provides evidence of proximal mineralization. And this video of a photogrammetry model on the left shows a fracture coating exhibiting a thick red iron oxide coating. And it's these sort of fractures that I'll be talking about today and how we can use them as a tool for mineral exploration. It is not the white vein that you see on the model that I'll be talking about. So sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about what a fracture coating actually is. So hopefully that makes it a little bit more clear. So some previous work does exist in this field, and that was kind of why I was interested in continuing it forward. In 2021, Valentino and colleagues published a study undertaken surrounding the McArthur River unconformity uranium deposit in the Athabasca Basin in Canada, looking at fracture coatings within drill core around the mineralization system. This study showed that 7 main fracture types existed surrounding the deposit based on color, mineralogy, chemistry, and the 7 main types are shown in this slide. This research highlighted that these fracture coatings can extend the footprint of an ore system, and that the mineralogy and chemistry of a fracture coating can indicate proximity to mineralization. However, there was a gap in that knowledge in in that research was that it was indicating that these fracture coatings could be useful for exploration, but research really needed to be applied to, other deposits in other different geological environments to understand, limitations, increase case studies, for overall use in, understanding its effectiveness in these exploration programs. As you know, not all deposits are the same way, and maybe different geological environments we may not be present are be effective in the same way. But studying fracture coatings in other geological environments, as we discovered, was a bit of a challenge, as they don't all have a sufficient coating for analysis. So we were to use the previous method to gain chemical information from the fracture coatings, which involves the removal of a coating with a dental drill to produce a powder, and then you react that powder with different acids to gain information about the chemistry. In samples with very thin fracture coatings, such as this black fracture coating seen on the screen, you'd end up sampling some of the host rock as well. And this host rock would contribute like a chemical signature that does not really reflect the most recent fluid flow interaction within the fracture pathway, and that would potentially dilute a chemical signature that is being recorded on the fracture coating from potentially dispersion of elements associated with the proximal deposit. So my research was split into two parts. The first part was to develop an in situ laser ablation method to analyze the chemical composition of these fracture coatings. And the second part was to apply that developed method to fracture coatings surrounding the Oberon gold deposit in the Northern Territories of Australia. So I'm first going to talk about, developing the in situ laser ablation method for analyzing the chemical composition of fracture coatings, especially those with very thin coatings. So this figure illustrates the workflow that was developed to analyze the element content on fracture coatings. First, samples are mounted on a thin section. This just made it easier to put in the sample chamber. And then using a scanning electron microscope, we produce these low backscatter electron maps to see textures and mineralogies to really identify areas for analysis on the fracture surface. Once a target is identified as indicated by the red squares on the slides, samples are mounted in the sample chamber ready for laser ablation analysis. For those not familiar with the technique, once the sample has been mounted in the sample chamber and you find the area selected for analysis on the laser system, the surface is hit with like a focused laser beam, which generates fine particulate matter. This is, transported and ionized and then put into the mass spec for analysis. And the reason we really were interested in developing this technique is it allows for direct targeting of the fracture surface, so you know exactly what you're going after. And it also, you can minimize the contribution of the host rock to the geochemical signature, as you know what you're ablating. A few considerations that we had to take into account when applying this technique to the fracture coatings. Firstly, you'll notice that the topography of these fracture samples is highly variable. This meant traditional line ablation, which is lasering lines across the sample, could not be used. And the thickness of the fracture coating also is not uniformed across the sample, which meant we had to consider the amount of time we lasered the sample for or changing the integration windows. We used a cell space spot grid pattern to overcome, some of those topography issues that could occur with line laser ablation. And then the data reduction was reduced in IOLITE 4, which is a software package for laser ablation, processing of laser ablation data. We also cut the time of the analysis to 5 seconds as the data integration, as this was found to increase sensitivity and only target the surface of the fractures, representing the most recent fluid flow. And accounting for some of those issues we talked about, the fracture coating not being uniformed in thickness across the surface. And once this overall produces an end product of rasterized geochemical maps, which show the element concentration on the surface of the fracture coatings. And this slide just shows some of those rasterized geochemical maps. And this one is showing pathfinder elements for unconformity hosted uranium deposits. So the first image on the top left is an SEM image highlighting, a location of a manganese oxide that we found on the fracture coating on one of these fracture coatings that I analyzed. It always reminds me of a heavily deformed Australia. So I like to show this one. And so, with these maps, you can kind of do a few things. We can see like the spatial relationships of how elements are distributed on the fracture surface. And you can see that the sample is not homogeneous across the surface, which does have implications for using other geochemical non-in situ techniques to analyze these coatings. It also allows for us to identify, mineral phases, which are hosting the pathfinder elements. And we can also see that the pathfinder element associations with other pathfinder elements. So, not all pathfinders are doing the same thing. In addition, we can generate bulk geochemical values. So you can integrate the area and produce a bulk geochemical value, or you can actually go after values for specific mineralogy as seen on the bottom of the screen. So the manganese oxide, for instance, I just took the values and compared them, integrated the data across that area. So usually you can tell which more minerals are enriched in certain pathfinders versus which minerals are less enriched. And all of this is kind of going into understanding, the mineral chemical relationship on the surface of the fracture coating, which could be used as a vector for exploration. So once we've kind of established that method, we applied this method to analyze the chemistry of fracture coatings above the Arboron Gold deposit, which is located in the Northern Territories in collaboration with Newmont. This location provided the opportunity to see if fracture coatings could record evidence of the element dispersion from our systems, not only within a different deposit type, but also within a regolith environment. These environments are subject to, intense chemical weathering, which may destroy, chemical and textual evidence of fluid flow migration. So we weren't actually sure if they were going to exist at this site. And we also wanted to see if they did, if we could comprehend, looking at the fracture film, mineralogy and chemistry, if it could provide insight into the mechanisms of transport and development of geochemical anomalies through cover to aid with mineral exploration within the region. The Arboron Gold deposit itself is relatively understudied, but low-grade mineralization exists at the surface, and high-grade mineralization exists within the axial zone. It's hosted in metasedimentary rocks, metamorphosed to green schist facies, hosted in doubly plunging anticline intersected by multiple igneous intrusions, as seen on the right of the screen. The site does have a geochemical anomaly at surface, and flooding of the site has been observed as seen on the photo. And this is just from the Arboron Gold site, showing water rising to the surface. So in August 2019, me and one of my supervisors flew out to the Tanami operation for sample collection. And this is really important to discuss because, if we were to implement this in other exploration programs, it's like, what would you do and what would you wouldn't do? We quickly discovered that using old core in this environment that had been exposed to the elements was kind of unsuitable for analysis, as you can see on the top, there was this iron oxide layering, which was adding an additional layer of coating to the samples, which we needed to really avoid, and it made it really unsuitable to carry out this sort of thing on those core. But we were lucky that there was fresh core available to be sampled, as seen on the bottom. And these are just a few of the drill boxes. And I've also highlighted in red squares, potential places that were identified for sampling, where a distinct fracture and mineralogical layer was observed. We found that the cores that we took from were altered to about 100 meters, with more intensely alteration occurring in the upper 20 meters. And this made it quite difficult to decipher fracture coatings versus host rock. But like for host rock that had just fractured at the stages of drilling or being moved around in the core box. And with any sort of field sampling program, you always get some additional furry helpers that make life a little bit more interesting when you're sampling. So yeah, we had a lot of dingoes on site that like to steal some of the backpacks and sampling blocks. So from fieldwork, we noticed that 8 major fracture types existed based on color. I get asked why we use color. Color was used as it's an easily identifiable feature in the field. The mineralogy and very fine grained nature of these samples just make it the easiest thing to base classification off. The 8 main types consisted of orange, purple, white, red, green, black, brown. And we also saw these multicolored coatings, which indicated multiple fluid flow interaction potentially occurring on the fracture surface. We found that these purple, red, and blacks were more abundant at this site that we sampled from, and they existed at greater depth. So in terms of the methods, I've already mentioned that we tackled the chemistry using the laser ablation method, but for mineralogy, we also concentrated on in situ methods. They included, energy dispersive spectroscopy, analysis with a scanning electron microscope. We also did some veneer and swerve spectroscopy, and we also sent some samples away for hyperspectral imaging. The hyperspectral imaging is on the bottom of the screen to the right-hand side. It's just to kind of show that we kind of did this to see what the fracture coding looked like, but also what the mineralogy was to the adjacent wall rock as well, to see if it was similar or if it was very distinct from each other. So it was looking for the absence of presence of minerals. In addition to the laser ablation method that we developed, we also sent some rocks for whole rock geochemistry just to get a representation of the background across a suite of elements. So choosing a subset of these 20 open fracture samples, these BSE images show the main mineralogical and textures observed. With each image, you'll notice a colored square, and this shows fracture coding colors that the mineralogy or texture was displayed the most in which fracture types. So some important ones that I'll highlight, which played a role in understanding the chemistry later. We saw botryoidal goethite, which is seen in A. This was common in blacks, purples, and a little extent browns. We saw some euhedral quartz and white micas in the white coatings. Gypsum covered a few of the different fracture types occurring paragenetically later on the fracture than other minerals. And we also saw hematite as seen in F and H with 2 different types of textures overall. So applying the applied laser ablation method, we generated these bulk element content for each fracture coding. And this is where we integrated the data over the whole sample grid to generate one value for each sample. Sorry, my cat is going a little crazy. Okay. As you can see, arsenic, sulfur, and gold was highlighted as anomalous in all surface media based on some previous studies done in the area. This figure shows the sulfur and arsenic concentrations taken from the fracture coatings plotted with depth, lithology, and fracture color within the drill holes. Gold is not displayed, as even though it does show on the surface of the fracture coatings, as seen in the top right of the screen, it is quite spotty. And when you integrate the data to generate a bulk concentration of this value, it masks any signal of the gold. So that is why it wasn't plotted up, but it does exist on some of them. So most fracture coatings did show elevated pathfinder concentrations with a few exceptions. And there is like a slight decrease in pathfinder concentrations to the east. And this may be related to transphotic cover being thicker in the east, but I feel like more research would have to be done to confirm that. And, this is just a few examples of these coatings that show high arsenic and low arsenic. So you can see the black fracture 152 observed in drill hole TIDN 0133 had quite high arsenic, and that's what it looks like. Whereas, some of the lower concentrations of arsenic were seen in the green, and that's what it looks like as well. So if we plot data by fracture color, we see that purple, black, and brown and multicolored fracture types show the highest arsenic values on the top left. And we tend to show higher concentrations in comparison to other analysis that was undertaken in some of the rocks on the same drill core the drill hole that we sampled from. Similar patterns were observed with purple and black fracture types when we summed the Pathfinder elements found on the fracture coatings, and that is on the top right. Sulfur showed no correlation with fracture type, and we think this is to do with most likely reflecting the contribution of this paragenetically late gypsum that were observed on some of the fracture coatings. Iron content showed some correlation with color, as seen in D, and we found that fractures that show a high iron also showed an increase in Pathfinder elements. And interestingly, these samples were also associated with the botryoidal goethite that I showed. We had some outliers in the data, and it can be accounted for by looking at the mineralogy and chemistry. That we did sample some fractures that didn't actually represent, fracture coatings, but those fractured wall rock that I said that was really difficult to decipher in the field. So if we bring this all together, what does that mean in terms of exploration? So I think the first important thing to state is that we did find fracture coatings at the Oberon Gold deposit, above it. Hyperspectral really helped highlight a distinction in mineralogy in these fracture coatings to the near fracture host rock. These samples were also dominant in goethite, which was found quite unique to the fracture coating. It was not observed in any of the host rock. These fracture types shown here, purples, browns, and blacks, also contained the higher association of R-associated elements. And we believe most likely represent fractures that form from R-associated fluids, moving through these fractures into the environment and exchanging with the fracture surface to leave behind this distinct chemical and mineralogical R signature. Iron oxides are highlighted, and it seems to play a really important role in the system as acting for traps for migrating ions. And therefore, in future exploration programs, I'd recommend, that these types are sampled or analyzed and they have the greatest potential to act as vectors for mineral exploration. However, we also found that classification was hard, and some of the fracture types most likely represented fractured wall rock rather than a fracture coating, and some of these are just shown here. Most of these samples had very little iron oxide present, tended to represent fracture types that showed these lower concentration of Pathfinder elements. And hyperspectral imaging also showed that they had the most similar mineralogy between the fracture surface and the host. And it's recommended that these should be avoided in exploration programs because they're not as useful for indicating potential mineralization source nearby. So I just want to sum up a few things and a few takeaway points about my research. It was the first application of using laser ablation for measuring element content in situ on fracture coatings. We can now measure samples that show lean fracture coatings. We're not sampling host rock, only the geochemical signature from the fracture surface. We're understanding a lot better how elements are residing on these fracture coatings, but also increasing the sensitivity of measurements, which has implication for non-in situ techniques. And of course, any sort of thin film coating this technique could be applied to. When we applied this to fracture coatings from Oberon Gold deposit, we're showing that fracture coatings are preserved and recording evidence of element dispersion. We're finding that, fractures above 200 meters record this anomalous Pathfinder element content in comparison to background, enhancing the size of the deposit footprint. Botryoidal goethite is associated with high iron and this Pathfinder element content, which is exhibited by purple, black, and brown fracture types that I showed. And, I feel like they should be targeting explorations in the Tanami region. So I'll just leave it here. Fracture coatings, they're very underutilized still in the industry. And this kind of research is showing that we do have the potential to add something more to an exploration program. So, using it in conjunction with the other tools, I feel like it could add an additional tool to the toolbox to help in exploration programs. I'd like to thank everyone of my sponsors for making this research happen, and my supervisors, and for the Mineral Deposit Division for inviting me to speak at today's webinar, and thanks for awarding me the poster award. So I hope you found it interesting, and thanks for listening.